Good morning and welcome to the American Rescue Plan Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools, ARPeans Program Launch Webinar. Today is February 21st and we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules this morning to join us for this informational session. My name is Kenya Jenkins and I am the Director of Federal Support here at the Louisiana Department of Education. Along with me this morning, we have our colleague, Ms. Marge Roberts from PNN that will be assisting us with the webinar this morning. In order to save bandwidth, if you could ensure that you have muted your lines and ensure that your cameras are off, we would greatly appreciate it. We are recording this webinar for later playback for you all. Please note that it can take up to a week to have the recorded webinar loaded to our website. But I just want to let you know that it is being recorded. And again, we thank you for joining us. Now I will turn things over to Marge Roberts.
Good morning, everybody. And as Kenya mentioned, we do want to thank you all for attending today. As she kind of already described, and as you can see on our PowerPoint, today we're going to be talking about the American Rescue Plan Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools program. Obviously, that's a little bit of a mouthful, so you might hear us refer to it as ARPeans throughout the presentation. So I will likely say that often without the next hour. So before we get started, we have a ton of really great material to cover today, but we do want to make sure we have an opportunity to get through all of the information. So if you have a question, we are going to ask that you use that chat feature to go ahead and type your question and submit your question in the chat feature. But please note when you're doing that, please include an email address. This is going to allow us to follow back up with you via email after the webinar with an answer to your question. So again, just make sure you're including an email address in the chat feature if you're submitting a question. That way we'll be able to follow up with you after the webinar to answer that question accordingly. So now we're going to go ahead and get started. So before we even jump into our agenda today, I did want to mention that we recognize, again, a lot of information coming your way today. So you might have some additional questions later or once you start an application, once you kind of get into the details. So we will have a follow-up webinar that's going to happen in a couple of weeks. We'll touch on it in a couple slides, but I just wanted to kind of get that out in front of you at the beginning of the presentation. So obviously we're going to start off with a little bit of information about the American Rescue Plan Act. Next, we're going to go over some program timelines. So that's going to be really important to kind of keep these dates in mind as you're going through the process of participating in the program. We're going to identify what the eligibility requirements are for the program. So who's eligible? We're also going to go over the application and specifically the allocation of funding that could potentially be available to an eligible school. We're going to give you a high-level look at the program steps. So what are the different steps throughout the process if you participate in the program from start to finish? Naturally, we're going to let you know how you can access that application, as well as access a bunch of resources that we've put together for you that are going to be of great use as you're filling out the application and as you are working through the program. We're going to talk a little bit about how to complete an application. We're also going to give you an understanding as to what are considered allowable future expenditures. We're also going to give you a little bit of a high-level overview of what the procurement process looks like when we get to that step in the program. And then we're going to round it out with some common questions at the end that we think are going to be useful. They are questions that we know get asked a lot, so I think those will be very helpful. And we've got some next steps and resources kind of laid out for you at the end. So what is the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARP? So first and foremost, I know that some schools may be familiar with the previous EANS program. So I figured we would get that question right out of the gate. So we're going to go ahead and address that now. I want to be very clear that these are two separate programs that have two separate funding sources. So the previous EANS program was funded through CRSA, or the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. This EANS program, the one that we're discussing today, is funded through the American Rescue Plan Act. So you might hear them be referred to throughout this presentation as either CRSA EANS, meaning that previous program, or ARPeans, meaning this program. Now, while they are similar in name, nature, and function, again, they are completely separate programs. So now let's talk a little bit about this program. Again, it's the American Rescue Plan Act, was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Biden on March 11th, 2021. What is it? It's a $1.9 trillion economic stimulus package. Now, of that funding, $2.75 billion is for the American Rescue Plan's Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools, or ARPeans program. And of that, Louisiana specifically was awarded $55 million through the American Rescue Plan Act for the EANS program. And the program is available to provide non-public schools with services or assistance to address educational disruptions resulting from COVID-19. So that last bullet point on here is where some of you that are familiar with the CRSA EANS program, you might be thinking this sounds kind of similar to that program. Like I said, they are similar in nature and function, but they are completely separate. So this slide really goes over a concept of who is the recipient of federal financial assistance. So some schools might have this question that if my school or my student is receiving services or assistance under the ARPeans program, does that make us, the school, a recipient of federal financial assistance? And the answer is no. So under the EANS program, a governor is actually the recipient of the federal financial assistance, and the governor is then responsible for ensuring that the state education agency, meaning LDOE in this instance, administers the program in accordance with applicable laws, including civil rights laws. So as a result of kind of how that plays out, certain federal requirements that would apply to the recipient of federal financial assistance are not directly applicable to a non-public school just because your students or your teachers receive assistance under this program. So that's a very important distinction to make and question that we get often. Program timelines. So obviously you're going to want to have an understanding of a couple key dates as you go through the process. The first one's pretty self-explanatory, and you're probably like realizing that that's what's happening right now. So February 21st, 2022, we are holding our ARPeans webinar. Now this one is tagged as program information because that's what we're going over today. We're giving you a very high level understanding of the program as a whole. It's kind of our introductory program launch webinar. Now, the next date on here is not far off. It's actually this Thursday, February 24th, 2022. And that is actually when the application opens. So that's a very, very important date. You're going to want to know when the application is available to you. Now, because the application does open this Thursday, that means on Thursday, should you want to, you could fill out an application for your school. However, I want to point you in the direction of that third date that you see listed in our table, March 7th, 2022. That's when we're going to hold an additional webinar that is tagged as the application demonstration. So what we're going to do on that date is we're going to use our hour time allotment to have a real live demonstration of filling out an application. So from start to finish, logging in, clicking every button, showing you what types of questions are being asked, what are the correct way to fill out certain questions based on the answers that we're looking for, how to upload documents, all that good stuff that would assist you in understanding the application will be demonstrated and recorded so that it can be posted on LDOE's website. So that is a very, very helpful webinar, in my opinion, if you have questions about that application. And you might want to wait and attend that webinar before you go ahead and fill out your application for your school. Naturally, though, you're probably thinking, well, if I wait until March 7th, to fill out the application because I'd like to see that demonstration. How much longer do I have? So when does the application close? If I wait until the 7th, have no fear. The 4th date that you see on the screen, March 28th, 2022, that is when the ARPeans application closes. So it is 32 days after the release of the application. So you've got plenty of time after March 7th to fill out that application and get it in before the application closes on March 28th. Now the next date on here, April 27th, 2022, that's listed as our eligibility review completion. So by April 27th, we will have reviewed all applications that were submitted, and we will determine whether or not each of those is eligible to participate in the program based on the eligibility requirements. Now, June 15th, 2022, that one's listed as our anticipated future procurement review completion. So what that is stipulating is that by April 27th, we're just saying that we're going to review every single application to make sure you're eligible or not. And then we're going to go look at all the applications to see the items that you've requested as future procurement, whether or not those are allowable. And that's going to be completed, or that portion of the review will be completed by June 15th. But I do want to note that is an anticipated, not guaranteed future procurement review date. And it does not guarantee that procured items would necessarily be delivered by that date, but they will be confirmed, hopefully by that date. Eligibility. So who is eligible for the program? A very important question. So for purposes of the ARPeans program, a school is eligible if the school is 1, an elementary or secondary school, as defined by section 8101 and 45 of the ESEA, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. 2, the school is a nonprofit. 3, the school is accredited, licensed, or otherwise operates in accordance with state law approval with Brumfield v. Dodd. 4, the school was in existence prior to March 13th, 2020, which is the date the president declared the national emergency due to COVID-19. And the last one on here says that the school did not and will not apply for and receive a loan under the SBA's Paycheck Protection Program, or sometimes people refer to it as PPP program, and that is made on or after December 27th, 2020. Now, one more slide really about eligibility, because there is a couple of other requirements for this particular program. So in addition to all the ones that we just went over on that previous slide, under ARPeans, LDOE can only serve non-public schools that enroll a significant percentage of students from low-income families and schools that are considered most impacted by the COVID-19 emergency. So it's not 3 of 5 or 1 of 10. You have to meet all of the requirements on the previous slide, as well as meet these 2 eligibility requirements in order to be eligible for ARPeans. So naturally, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to enroll a significant percentage of students from low-income families? That is defined by LDOE as having 22% or more of the total student enrollment being students that are coming from low-income families. What does it mean to be most impacted by the COVID-19 emergency? Well, that's defined by LDOE in accordance with federal guidance to include the impacts that you see listed here on the screen. So did your school suffer a loss of instructional time, a loss of tuition revenue, maybe decrease in enrollment? Maybe you experienced learning loss attributable to educational disruptions that were caused by COVID-19. Maybe your school experienced some social, emotional, or mental health impacts attributable to the disruption of instruction. Maybe there was a lack of capacity to provide remote learning due to insufficient technology support, or there was a lack of resources to address safety measures. So any one of these things can be considered as something that would designate your school as most impacted by the COVID-19 emergency. And once again, I just want to reiterate that in order for your school to be eligible for ARPeans, you must meet all of the eligibility requirements that we've gone over just now. So the application and allocation. So the ARPeans program application process is going to require one application to be submitted. Now, you'll notice the words one application are bolded and underlined, because if your school is familiar with the Recipient program, that previous program, that one had 2 applications. However, the ARPeans program has only one application. So you're only going to fill out one application where you're going to answer questions about eligibility, and you're going to enter in any future procurement requests. But if you remember from the earlier slide on timelines, we're going to review all applications for eligibility first, and that's going to result in a final population of eligible schools and final approved allocation amounts. So basically, once we've reviewed everyone's application for eligibility and we've got that final population of eligible schools, then we're going to go review those eligible schools' future procurement requests. And that's going to result in a notice being issued to those schools that will identify which of those future procurement requests are being denied or approved under the ARPeans program. So allocation, there is a preliminary allocation amount that has been determined. So a preliminary amount of funds that has been determined for ARPeans services and assistance. And it's been calculated for those schools where we have preliminary data that tells us that school had a percentage of students from low-income families greater than or equal to 22% for the 2019 to 2020 school year. So remember, that's that important eligibility requirement that we went over a couple slides ago. So where the program had preliminary data indicating that a school did in fact have a percentage of students from low-income families greater than 22%, a preliminary amount has been determined. Now that spreadsheet will be located on the Federal Support and Grantee Relations Library on Thursday, February 24th, when the application opens. That's where all the resources are going to be available on that day. Now, some schools might on Thursday go check out that preliminary allocation spreadsheet, and you might see that your school is not listed on the spreadsheet. So your next question obviously is probably, well, if I'm not on that spreadsheet, can I still apply for the program? Yes, you can still apply. If your school is not on that spreadsheet, you can still apply, but you're just going to need to demonstrate that your school did have a percentage of students from low-income families that was greater than or equal to 22%, again, for that 19 to 20 school year, and provide additional supporting information related to your number of students from low-income families enrolled in that year. So what is the allocation formula methodology? It's comprised of 2 components. So essentially you get one allocation based on your total student enrollment, and then you get an additional allocation for those enrolled students that are from low-income families. And it's a per pupil amount of $1,994, roughly. It's been rounded to the nearest dollar for representation in this spreadsheet, or excuse me, in the presentation. So it's an additional $1,994 per each student from low-income families. So I realize some schools and some people might want to see that in more of a formulaic layout, which is why we've laid it out as such on the bottom of this slide here. So you can see, if you want to figure that out, it's total student enrollment times 1,994 plus total students from low-income families times 1,994, and that's going to give you the total preliminary allocation amount. A reminder, this is based on the information from the 2019 through 2020 school year. Some people might obviously be asking, well, where did that data come from, where you were deciding what those preliminary allocation amounts were? And I just want to point out, these are preliminary amounts that were calculated for schools where that preliminary data indicated they had a percentage of students from low-income families greater than or equal to 22%. And they're an estimate because the final data for one or two of those data sets is not yet available. But the 2 data sets that were utilized were based on total student enrollment and total students from low-income families. We broke them out separately on this slide to identify that for all schools, the data set utilized for total student enrollment when we were calculating preliminary allocations was the program used that final student enrollment data that was supplied by the eligible non-public schools for the 19 to 20 school year within the non-public schools data collection. So all schools, we use the same data set. Now, when we look at the right-hand side, total students from low-income families, that's where there's kind of a fork in the road. And it's dependent upon whether or not that school participated in the CURSA-EANS program. Because if you're familiar with that program, we had some similar requirements. So if a school participated in CURSA-EANS, the final low-income student count determined through CURSA-EANS eligibility is what we use for the preliminary allocation amount. But if a school did not participate in CURSA-EANS, the preliminary low-income student count data as reported to the non-public school system for participation in equitable services under Title I Part A program is what we use for that preliminary allocation amount. So hopefully this helps you understand a little bit more about where the numbers came from in determining the preliminary allocation amounts. Now, again, I said these were preliminary. So there is a point in time in which the ARPeans final allocation amounts will be determined, and that's going to happen after all applications have been submitted and reviewed for eligibility. So we're going to have everybody submit your applications where you're answering questions both about eligibility and you're requesting your future procurement requested items. And then we're going to review all of those for eligibility to come up with the final list of eligible schools. And then that's when we'll be able to take the preliminary allocation amounts. They'll be adjusted upward or downward as appropriate based on the total number of schools that apply and that are deemed eligible and their final low-income student data. So a very, very important piece of information on this slide that relates to kind of how the program is set up and the different steps is, I probably should have bolded it, maybe even made it red so that you would really hit home on the fact that applications cannot be edited after submission. That is arguably one of the most important things I'll tell you today. So when you go to fill out that application, you're encouraged to request any and all services or assistance that you feel is necessary for your school as it relates to the disruptions of COVID, even if you think it might make you go over that preliminary allocation amount. Remember, you're going to be filling out the application based on the preliminary allocation amount, either on that spreadsheet, or if you weren't on that spreadsheet that you calculated for yourself. And then you're going to get a final allocation amount later on in the program that will be posted to the website. But applications cannot be edited after they've been submitted. So if you submit your application this Thursday, because you had everything ready, and then 3 weeks later, you attend that demonstration webinar and you didn't realize laptops were something that schools commonly requested, and you email us saying, hey, I'd like to add in 100 laptops for my school, you're not going to be able to do that. So I would encourage you to review all resources, attend the webinar, talk to all of your departments, see what your school really needs, and then submit it when you have a full understanding of what it is your school deems necessary as it relates to the disruptions from COVID-19. Again, very important. I'm going to sound like a broken record. Your application cannot be edited after submission. So now we're going to go over the program steps. So first, we talked about this a little bit already, so you might understand this kind of right out the gate, but you're going to fill out an application. And then following your submission of that application, any school that's eligible is going to receive what's called a notice of eligibility. And if your school is deemed ineligible because you didn't meet all of those eligibility requirements we went over, you're going to receive what's called a notice of ineligibility. Remember, after we figure out all of the schools that are eligible, we're going to review all those eligible schools' future procurement requests and issue what's called a notice of allowable costs. It's basically just going to outline all of the approved future procurement requests. Finally, the program is going to use the school's final allocation amount to fund the allowable future expenditures. Application accessibility and resources. So you've heard all the information, you think your school is eligible, you want to participate. Where do you go to access the application this Thursday? Remember, all the resources and the information is going to be available on Thursday, the 24th, and they're going to be located on the Federal Support and Grantee Relations Library. And there's a couple of programs that are going to be listed in that library. So make sure you're locating the American Rescue Plan Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools program section and look for any resources labeled ARPeans. So much like this webinar is our ARPeans launch webinar, any other documents or resources we're going to go over today are going to have that indication in the front of the name. It's going to say ARPeans and then dash whatever the resource is. So please review those resources before you fill out the application, while you're filling them out, before preferably, but definitely at least while. And then when you really think you're ready, click the button and go ahead and apply for the program. So what are these resources that I keep mentioning? And like I said, they're all going to have the ARPeans designation in front of their name. We've got a program one-pager, and we're going to go over each of these really quickly at a high level in the next couple slides. We've got an application user manual, a future procurement catalog, a frequently asked questions, a program application walkthrough, and something that's called the impact of COVID-19 factors and documentation examples. So what's the program one-pager? It's kind of what it sounds like. It is a one-pager that's going to give you a high-level overview of what the program is, what the eligibility requirements are, some information that you might need in order to fill out your application. So you don't see it in the screenshot because this is just the screenshot is an image of the top of the one-pager, but right underneath the eligibility requirements will be a list of some common documentation that might help to have when you go to fill out that application. And then it's also going to list out the program timeline of those important dates. So that's kind of what we went over a few slides ago related to the webinars, application opening and closing, et cetera. The application user manual. So this is a really good document that is has a lot of information, but it walks you through every step of the application. So it's going to give you some information on how to locate the portal, how to access it, how to maneuver your way through the application. It's basically an instructional manual. It says, click here to start filling out your application. This is what this question is asking for. And it's got screenshots, images, helpful text, etc. So definitely a really great resource in addition to the webinar that we're going to have on March 7th as it relates to how to fill out the actual application. The future procurement catalog. So there's a lot of text on this screen, but I want to be very clear about this resource in particular. So this is kind of a new resource in that we get a lot of questions or have gotten a lot of questions in prior programs about what is an item that I can request or who can I request an item from? I want a list of all the things I could possibly ask for. So this future procurement catalog, it was put together in an effort to kind of assist the schools when they go to fill out that application. So it's got a lot of good information on it. It's got a list of commonly requested technology items along with that technology contract vendor who can provide that item, should it be deemed allowable. It's also got a list of commonly requested non-technology goods, services, or assistance. And then those non-technology goods, services, or assistance are broken down into two categories. Those that are from a state contract vendor and that state contract vendor's available categories, and then non-contract vendors and their corresponding available categories. So basically the items that are in that catalog can be utilized when you're filling out the future procurement section of your application. You can put those in the future procurement section of the application. And these items do use state contractors already in place. So they might result in a quicker procurement based on availability. And I know that's a very important thing to you all and to your schools, that if there's an option to get an item through a state contract that's already in place, and that means I might get it quicker, that's a huge deal. So this resource is going to be invaluable as you're filling out the future procurement section of the application. I do want to be very clear, though, that the program doesn't require you to request the services and assistance that are listed in that catalog, nor do we preclude you from requesting any services or assistance that you deem necessary for your school as it relates to dealing with COVID-19. Again, this is just a list of common requested ones that also have the use of state contracts, so they could potentially result in that quicker procurement for you. So it's a really long document because we put a lot of time and effort into getting you a lot of good information about common items and their vendors. So this is just a quick screenshot of 2 of the sections to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like. Under the commonly requested technology items and their vendors, you can see the different calculators that are available. You can see different accessories like cables, computer mice, charging carts, docking stations, document cameras, and then each of them has a contracted vendor or vendors that are available to provide those items on the right-hand side. Another section that I included a screenshot of is meant to give you an idea of those commonly requested non-technology goods, services, or assistance. So what did we see a lot of? People requesting COVID-related signage, cleaning supplies, masks, hand sanitizer, thermometers, water fountain, water bottle filler stations, outdoor furniture to have class outside or to allow social distancing outside where you couldn't inside. So like I said, really, really important resource as you're filling out the future procurement section of your application. Frequently asked questions is pretty much what it sounds like. It is a list of frequently asked questions along with their respective program responses. So the screenshot is just the top, sort of obviously question 1 and 2 of the frequently asked questions document, just so you can see how it's formatted. If you were to want to know what the program is, there's the answer. If you want to know what the eligibility requirements are, there's your answer. Now, we've already gone over these 2 particular questions. However, this document has, if I'm not mistaken, upwards of 40 questions listed. So just because you happen to know the answer to the 2 that are listed in the screenshot doesn't mean there's not going to be other questions in there that are very helpful to your school and to you when you're filling out the application. So I would implore you to please read through the frequently asked questions. We, again, spent a lot of concerted time and effort looking at what questions we've already gotten to hopefully provide you with information right out of the gate. So it's important that you're going to go review that. You can even, Control F on your keyboard, search for keywords if you know the particular question you have in mind. But please do review that, especially before you start submitting questions. We're here to answer any of your questions, but they might already have an answer that's listed out in that FAQ document. So definitely check that out. The application walkthrough. So remember, that's what we've talked a little bit about already. It's happening on March 7th, and lucky for you, it will also be me in that webinar. So hopefully you're getting used to the sound of my voice and you like it. Because it's going to be a recording where I go in and fill out an application step by step, give you instructions. You'll hear me speaking about how I'm filling it out while visually watching me fill it out all the way through to completion. Again, if the date and time don't work for you, we are going to record it and post it to the website after the presentation. Now, our last resource that we're going to go over is called the ARPeans Impact of COVID-19 Factors and Documentation Examples. Lengthy title, so let me talk a little bit about what that means. You already heard me mention in the beginning of the presentation that in order to be eligible for the ARPeans program, your school has to be considered a school that was most impacted by COVID-19. So what does it mean? Remember, we went over those impacts of COVID. They're listed in the screenshot on the right: loss of instructional time, decreased enrollment, lack of resources to address safety measures, etc. You're going to be required to illustrate in your application which of those factors applies to your school in order to show that you've met the requirement of being impacted by COVID-19. And then the Department of Education or its auditors may request any reasonable information from your school to describe or quantify the impact that you've selected. So it's not necessarily something that you're going to be asked to upload with your application, but at a later date, an auditor could request to see documentation to support the fact that your school had a loss of tuition revenue because you selected that on your application. So naturally, if you're thinking about filling it out and we're telling you that in the future, should somebody ask for this documentation based on what you've selected, you might want to get that information together ahead of time just to have it available. Again, not required with the submission, but important to be able to know what that documentation is. So the second half of this document gives you some examples of the documentation that could be used to support each of those COVID-19 impacts that are available as a selection within the application. All right, now the applicant portal. This program, I want to give you a disclaimer, not that I've already given you a ton probably, but we have a very fast turnaround. If you remember from our timeline slide, we've got 32 days, excuse me, that the application is open. And then we've got 30 days before we're going to review all the applications for eligibility. So we really need your school to be as proactive as possible in responding to the program. What does that mean? It means you need to regularly check the applicant portal for updates. Once we've started to review your application, we're going to be using the portal. A reviewer is going to be reaching out to you via the portal for any questions or supporting documentation they might have about your application. So you really need to be checking that portal in your account every 2 days to make sure there aren't any outstanding questions that you need to reply to. Because if we are reaching out to you, and we'll identify within that communication, but there is a mechanism in place that if we don't hear back from you after 3 business days, you might be considered unresponsive, and then you won't be deemed eligible for the program based on your unresponsiveness to the program. So be very cognizant of that. Make sure your contact information is up to date, it's accurate in the portal. If it changes because you filled the application out, and maybe another individual from your school is the one who you want answering questions when it comes time for that, you can change your contact information. You can email us, you can message your reviewer. You just need to let us know so that we make sure we're reaching out to the right person. And I want to also encourage you to use that application user manual and the EANS application walkthrough recording that we're going to do on March 7th to help you in filling out that application. You probably also noticed from the timelines in the beginning that we're going to be moving into some months that aren't necessarily the months in which students are regularly at school. So it's even more important during that time that we make sure we have the correct contact information for someone who's going to be available to answer questions about the program and or about your application. Completing the application. Now, again, March 7th demonstration will be more in detail, but just at a very high level, these are the different sections of the application. We are going to ask you to enter in some applicant information. That's very standard. That's your school name, address, your contact info, just general stuff like that. In part B, you're going to be answering questions about your school's low-income student numbers. In part C, you're going to be answering questions about your school's impact of COVID-19. In part D, you're going to be answering questions about your school's potential that your school might have received a loan under the SBA's Paycheck Protection Program, PPP. Part E, and now this is where it kind of breaks off a little. You'll notice there's a part E and a part F, and they both are listed as requests for services or assistance. However, part E is specific to software requests. Part F is for anything that's considered non-software. So we broke it up like that in the application because when you do get in there, and again, we'll go over this in more detail on the 7th, but there are some very specific questions related to software that the program needs to understand in order to get you the right software. We need to understand how many licenses, are they student licenses, teacher licenses, school-wide, how many years, just there's questions that don't really apply to non-software items. So that's why the application was broken out. So in part E, you're going to hit continue to add item until you've listed all of your software requests. And then you're going to move on to part F to enter in any non-software future procurement requests. Part G, inventory and shipping information. You're just going to enter in any information for your inventory point of contact, as well as any information you'd like us to know about shipping when and if we do get to a point where we're ready to ship items that have been approved to your school. And then part H, certifications by non-public schools for the ARPeans program. That's where you're going to read a bunch of information about what you're certifying to by filling out and submitting this application. I would encourage you not to gloss over those. You're reading and signing on behalf of your school. Obviously, it's a really good idea to read any legal document before you sign it. So just make sure you are reading those certifications carefully. And then finally, there's an attachment section that'll offer you the opportunity to attach any documentation that is required for your application. Again, at the bottom, we're just pointing out the user manual that's available or will be available, on Thursday in that federal support and grantee relations library. And as always, our email address for this program, if you have any questions, it's arpinfo@ldoe-eans.com. Allowable future expenditures. So what is allowable? I do want to point out that just because an item was listed on the future procurement catalog doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically allowed or automatically going to be approved for your school. So in this section, we're going to be talking about the overall allowability of any future procurement or future expenditure request. So your school, under this program, under ARPeans, future expenditure, can request services or assistance. Now notice in parentheses, we say not payment. So that's very important. If you were familiar with the Recipient program, under that program, schools could request reimbursement. They could have requested essentially a direct payment to the school for items that the school had already purchased that were related to COVID. However, that is not, I repeat, not an option under this ARPeans program. You can only receive future expenditures or items that are purchased by LDOE through LDOE's procurement process. Those items that you're requesting under future expenditure do have to meet a couple of requirements. They have to be requested for secular, neutral, and non-ideological costs. They have to be used to address educational disruptions resulting from the COVID-19 emergency and be reasonable, necessary, allocable, and allowable. Now, similar to CURSA, if you're familiar with that, LDOE will hold title to these materials that are being purchased with the ARPeans funds. And your school will be responsible for following LDOE's procurement and inventory process. You can use these items through the end of the program. The end of the program is September 30th, 2024. And your school will need to work directly with LDOE if you want to continue to use those items beyond that date. So what are the items that are allowed? Now, again, we've already mentioned that future procurement catalog, which lists out specific items. These are the actual categories of allowable items under the federal guidelines. So you've got them listed here for you. There's kind of a lot of information, and I'll go ahead and read off a few of them, but I don't want to spend too much time just reading off the slide for you. But we've got supplies to sanitize, disinfect, and clean school facilities. That was a very popular one of school requests. Educational technology is another popular request, which includes hardware, software, connectivity, assistive technology and adaptive equipment to assist students, educators, and other staff with remote or hybrid learning. Physical barriers to facilitate social distancing, personal protective equipment. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise, so I just want to remind everybody to mute yourselves. And we've got leasing sites or spaces to ensure safe social distancing. So again, these are all available in the federal guidelines, in this PowerPoint, in the FAQ, et cetera. So you can read them at a later date if you want to go into a little bit more detail. Naturally, some schools obviously want to know if there's any items that are specifically not allowed for future expenditure. And there are two particular items that are called out in the federal guidance as not allowable under the ARPeans program, and that are payroll expenses and vendor expenses to perform cleaning services. Now, you heard me mention on the previous slide, supplies to sanitize, disinfect is an allowable category. And now I'm saying vendor expenses to perform cleaning services is not allowed. So a school can be provided future services for cleaning supplies, but not for a vendor performing the cleaning. Wanted just to point that out because it is a little bit of a tricky one sometimes when schools are asking questions about that. Again, that future procurement catalog is going to be an amazing resource for you with some examples of allowable future expenditures. Procurement process. So just wanted to highlight here that the program cannot guarantee that all of the items requested for future expenditure will be provided, because we're going to review every single future expenditure request to make sure it is allowable. So did it meet all those requirements that we just went over? Is the final allocation amount for your school sufficient in order to cover the cost of that future expenditure request? And they're going to be procured based on available, previously approved and contracted LDOE vendors. So again, what that means is kind of what we're pointing to in that future procurement catalog. It's going to be really helpful for your school, maybe a quicker procurement if you're utilizing that when you're filling out the future procurement section of the application, as it's built based on current available contracts, state contracts, that is. So during that procurement process, each school is going to designate a point of contact for the inventory handling and the delivery of any potential future expenditure items. Essentially, that person is going to be responsible for any and all of the inventory tagging process, any of LDOE's inventory processes, as well as notifying the program when you receive that item. Now, more information regarding that inventory process will be available when the time comes, but just know that is a requirement of the program to let us know that you've actually received the item in question, and you'll be required to fill out an annual certification. But the LDOE property liaison will contact that school's designated point of contact when the time comes. Common questions. All right, this is a great section because again, we've highlighted some of the questions from our FAQ that are often asked that we think are going to be really helpful for you to understand before you open up the application and start filling it out. Obviously, where can I access it is a big one. So we went over that a little bit. It's going to be available on that Federal Support and Grantee Relations Library this Thursday, February 24th. And the resource materials that we've reviewed with you today are also going to be available in the Federal Support and Grantee Relations Library. How do I log back into my application to either respond to my reviewer or upload any additional documentation that I've been asked to provide? You can review that application user manual that's available for a walkthrough of these steps, or you can always email us at arpinfo@ldoe-eans.com should you have any questions about getting into your application. Can I edit my application? Can I switch the amounts? Can I request additional services or assistance after submission? Remember, this is a very important one for you to understand. The answer is no. Your application cannot be edited after it has been submitted. So that, again, make sure you are including all items you potentially think your school could want under the guise of the program when you're filling out the application. Even if you think what you've put in the application may go over that preliminary allocation amount, again, those are going to be adjusted upwards or downwards once we have the final population of eligible schools and we can allocate the 55 million across those eligible schools. I can't tell you how many times we got the question of, I didn't realize I could have asked for this item. Can I go back and add it? No, the answer is going to be no. You cannot edit your application to include additional items after it's been submitted. So once again, please use the resources available, specifically that procurement catalog. I think the document ends up being about 10 pages or so of available items, or example items, I should say, of common items. So please take the time to go look at that. Make sure you're not missing anything and you've got anything and everything you think your school could deem necessary as it relates to dealing with COVID included in that application before you hit submit. And you've got a couple days. Obviously, we've got about 32 for you to fill it out. So there is no necessary rush for you to fill it out on Thursday. Review the resources, attend the webinar, and then and only then go fill it out so that you make sure you're doing it right. Our eligible non-public schools under the CURSA EANS program, some people might refer to that as round one. We've heard people say that. Are those the same schools that are eligible for services or assistance under the ARPeans program, or round two, as we've heard it referred to? So not necessarily. Remember, these are two completely separate programs. And while they are like kind in name and function. The eligibility requirements that were outlined in CURSA-EANS of the ARP Act. In addition to those, that were just related to CURSA, ARP had some additional requirements, again, that the school enroll a significant percentage of students from low-income families, which is at a minimum 22%, and that you were most impacted by COVID-19. So those were the two main changes in terms of eligibility requirements from CURSA to ARP. Just because you participated in CURSA doesn't mean you're automatically eligible for ARP. If you didn't participate in CURSA, that means you can still participate in ARPeans. So we want to be very clear about that for all potential schools that are listening or thinking about applying. You might also be wondering, well, then what is the definition of a low-income family? That's defined as a family whose household income does not exceed 185% of the 2020 federal poverty level, consistent with final requirements. My school is not listed on that preliminary allocation spreadsheet. Can I still apply for the program? Now, we did talk a little bit about this earlier, but I think this is a question we're going to see a lot. So if your school's not on that spreadsheet, you can still apply for the program, but you're going to need to demonstrate that your school had a percentage of students from low-income families greater than or equal to that 22% for that 2019 to 2020 school year. You can use the allocation formula that we've laid out at the bottom of the screen, and that'll help you figure out an estimated allocation amount for your school as you go to fill out that application. Can I request reimbursement of services or assistance that were purchased by my school to address educational disruptions resulting from the COVID-19 emergency? No. So remember, under ARPeans funds cannot be used to provide reimbursements to a non-public school. You can only receive future procurement services and assistance from LDOE or its contractors to address these educational disruptions from COVID. So no reimbursements under ARPeans, only future procurements. What documentation is required to be uploaded by my school during the application? So I would actually encourage you to look at ARPeans FAQ number 16 and ARPeans program one-pager. Again, they're available on Thursday in the Federal Support and Grantee Relations Library, and they both include a list of documentation or information that may be needed when filling out your application. I say may, and I put emphasis on may, because schools that participated in CURSA-EANS may not be required to provide all of the documentation or information that's listed in those questions, because we might be able to use some of your documentation from CURSA since the requirements were very similar. So just go read through that and make sure you're aware of which documentation you might need in order to fill out your application. Does my school need to submit formal quotes, current contracts, or solicit potential vendors when filling out the application? So vendor quotes for anything that you're requesting is not a requirement of completing your application. However, providing these vendor quotes may help the program and may help LDOE in facilitating that procurement process for any items in which you're approved for that service or assistance. So I would implore you to go review that EANS procurement catalog and our EANS FAQ, because they've got a lot of good information about the procurement process and when quotes might potentially be needed. Are installation costs associated with requested future procurements allowable? So this one, the answer is yes. The program funds generally may be only used for the cost of installation of supplies or equipment that is otherwise allowable, and not for installation of supplies or equipment that is not otherwise allowable. So that might sound a little tricky. Basically, if you're requesting that, under your application, let's say you ask for a smart board and there's an additional installation cost to install a smart board, if it's deemed allowable for your school because you've met all the requirements and the cost meets all the requirements to be allowable, then yes, the installation cost would be considered allowable. But if you're asking the program to supply an item that is not allowable under the program, then we're not going to be able to pay for the installation cost of that particular item. That also goes for items that the school may have purchased, which kind of bumps us into the next question. The next question says, are installation cost of windows allowed if my school buys the windows? So the program is not allowed to purchase new windows for schools under ARPeans, but to the extent your school used your own funds to purchase new windows for the purposes of helping ventilation, then LDOE may use ARPeans funds for the installation of those windows that your school purchased with its own funds. That one was an updated FAQ in the federal frequently asked questions. So we did want to point that out in our webinar, since that was a slight change from CURSA-eans to ARPeans. Where can I see a list of LDOE vendors and a list of services or assistance that LDOE can provide? Hopefully I have been a broken record and said it enough that some of you are like, I get it. She already said, go look at the future procurement catalog. I'll say it again because it's probably one of my favorite documents. It's got a whole bunch of items, commonly requested goods and services, as well as a listing of both state contract and non-state contract vendors for you to consider. But once again, you're not required to include only those items. You can include anything and everything your school might deem necessary. And then everything obviously would be reviewed under the program's allowability. When I'm requesting non-software future procurement requests, how do I enter in the quantity in units? So we wanted to be very clear about this one as well, because this caused a little confusion last time. But we have gone ahead and made this field a text field. So it's a free text field that allows you to specify the total number of items that are being requested in that individual entry. We've included some examples below of different ways that you could enter in the quantity in units of a requested item. So you could enter in, if you were asking for latex gloves, you could type in 3 boxes of 50 gloves. You could also type in 150 gloves if you don't really care the boxes or number that come in a box. You could request 2 packs of 3 bottles of hand sanitizer, or you could request 6 bottles of 16 ounces of hand sanitizer. So it is a free text field that allows you to be very specific, but I want to make sure you understand you should be entering in each individual item in its own entry within the application. Again, that'll be really clear when we do the demonstration on the 7th. And another really lengthy slide, basically, can your school purchase the items paid for and are provided by LDOE in order to keep them after 2024, September? No. So LDOE cannot sell or transfer any items to the non-public school. Equipment and supplies that are purchased through the program can be kept until September 30th of 2024, or until you no longer need them. Now, basically, the second bullet point says that if you still require that item after September 30th, 2024, you can maybe work with LDOE to show how you still need it for the purposes of another federal education program. But bullet point number 3 says that if your school has no justification to provide because the item is not required for another allowable purpose under another federal program, that item will revert back to the state and it's going to be entered into surplus. At that point in time, the item will go to Louisiana's Property Assistance Agency to be auctioned. And if your school is interested in purchasing the item through the auction, LPAA and LDOE can work with the school to list the school as a priority vendor for that particular item. So I know that was a common question we got last time, so I did want to make sure we addressed it. And I know we're right at time, but just our next resource, next steps and resources. Again, we just want to make sure everyone's aware the application will be available this Thursday, February 24th. Make sure you review the resource materials available on LDOE's website. We've got links to the website throughout. And the application deadline, Monday, March 28th, 2022 at 11:59 Central Standard Time. And as always, if you have any questions specific to the program, you can email arpinfo@ldoe-eans.com. If you want to give you a call back, you can specify that within your email and we'll call you back if the request is better suited for the phone. But we will get to all of your questions that you asked today within the chat. They'll be coming to you with a reply from that info account that you see listed here. So be on the lookout for an email from arpinfo@ldoe-eans.com if you typed in a question today or if you have a future question. And I know we're a minute or two over, but I did want to get to that last bit of information. And I want to thank everybody for your time and your patience today as we work through the ARPeans program information. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Kenya.
Thank you, Marge. We appreciate the wealth of information you've provided this morning to everyone. For those, I see a comment in the chat, a common question about the slides. As Marge mentioned in the presentation, all of the resources that were discussed today in the information webinar will be available Thursday in the Federal Support and Grantee Relation Library. So you will be able to access all of the documents, including the deck, in that actual, in the Federal Support and Grantee Relations Library on Thursday. So I just wanted to reiterate that. If you have any questions, the question slide is up. The questions that have been placed into the chat will be answered. That's why we wanted to make sure that you included your name and email address so that we could respond to you, because we knew the webinar was going to take the full length of time to provide you with all of the information. Once again, we want to thank everyone for attending this morning, getting this great information. If you have any questions, please email arpinfo@ldoe-eanes.com. All right. Thank you all, and we appreciate your time today. Have a great day.